2022 was a rocky year for the economy. Growth slowed, inflation ran rampant, and the stock market plummeted. What will the economy look like in 2023? Investor and writer Ruchir Sharma has a new piece in the Financial Times laying out some big shifts he expects to see this year and beyond. Ruchir, welcome.
Thanks, Fareed.
So the conceit here is that all the rules of the last decade have been overturned. Why? What do you think is happening?
Well, I think that the main event, at least from an economic perspective, has been the incredible tightening by the Federal Reserve. That the era of easy money, which we had with zero interest rates, a lot of quantitative easing, that's come to an abrupt end. And so many of the rules which applied when the Fed was running easy money policy, where governments could run large deficits, get away with it because funding was relatively easy, the cost of funding was very low, those rules have changed. And many leaders across the world have still not got this memo. They're still trying to spend and still trying to sort of rule as if they're in an easy money era.
And the best example of this is, of course, Liz Truss in Britain, right?
Yes, that's the best example and the most prominent example. And then you have lots of other countries now, all of a sudden facing the prospect of default. So many countries in Africa, even in places such as Pakistan, Egypt, all these are struggling just now. And the political leaders in all these countries are now being forced to bow to the markets and do what the markets are telling them, which is that you got to have fiscal rectitude, you got to have monetary orthodoxy, or you end up becoming a Turkey and Argentina that's kicked off the grid and loses complete access to funding and markets and become economic basket cases.
It reminds me of when Clinton came to power, that whole White House, 1992, was terrified about the bond market. You know, James Carville used to joke, when I get reincarnated, I want to come back as the bond market because the bond market scares the hell out of everyone. Well, for 30 years, people forgot about the bond market, and now the bond market is really back, except in one country. I want to ask you about the United States, where we seem to think because of the dollar, we can print as much money as we want. But you say we may be at peak dollar.
Yes, I think there's a lot of hubris on that. But even if you look at America, it clearly made a mistake in the amount of stimulus that they put to work. We're seeing the consequences of that with still relatively high inflation, even though it's coming off, and all this monetary tightenings. And look at the stock market, very tough year in 2022. So I think that there are consequences of this which even America is facing. But yes, there is still hubris that because we have the reserve currency, we can get away with it. And my warning is, don't be so confident. That we have seen what happened in UK, we have seen what's happened in so many other countries, that the markets really get in a punishing mood, the sentiment can turn very abruptly. The dollar's had an incredible rally over the last few years, but I think the seeds are now being sown for why the demise of the dollar may have begun. The dollar has peaked against most major currencies. And also this is a very important geopolitical point, which is the fact that even though America used sanctions, and you can argue it was morally correct to use those sanctions against Russia, but the way it used the sanctions by weaponizing the dollar, that I think will have long-term consequences. That there are so many countries around the world now which are thinking that they could also, even though it may be an irrational fear, that fear has crept in, that maybe even they could face such an event. And
the only solution is get out of dollars.
Exactly, in terms of or try and trade directly in your own currency.
End of big tech. People have been saying, every time the tech stocks go down, people have been saying this is the end of big tech. It didn't prove to be the case after the crash in 99. It hasn't proved to be the case after 08. What makes you think that this time, these companies like Apple, Microsoft, Google, that have so dominated the world, why do you think they're on the way down?
No, Fareed, I mean, in fact, if you look at the list of the top 10 companies in the world by market value at the beginning of each decade, and then you compare it to the subsequent decade, just a decade later, it's a fascinating statistic. 9 out of those top 10 companies typically fall off the top 10 list. That's what the creative destruction element of capitalism is all about. Once you get to such an elevated level, that sows the seeds of your own demise. And so therefore, as an investor, I would not be allocating any capital, even though 1 or 2 of them will do well and survive. The odds are against you that 80 to 90% of companies in the top 10 list at the start of a decade are usually not there a decade later. And I think that that process has begun now with higher interest rates.
And with that same cyclical process, in a sense, you're saying there's an element here of peak America, and it's now time for the rest of the world, particularly their stocks and things, to rally. Explain the logic behind that.
Well, there's one simple statistic out here, which is that America today is about 25-26% of the global economy. But if you look at America's share in global stock markets, what the value is, 60%. That is way higher. So America is punching well above its weight as far as global stock market value is concerned.
So let me understand this. America is 4% of the world's population.
Yes.
25% of the world's economic output, but 60% of the total stock market valuations of all the stock markets in the world put together is just America.
Exactly. And I think that this is very telling because it's not, a lot of people come back and tell me that, yeah, but America's always been the world's dominant financial superpower. It's always been a great capitalist system. And so it will always have the world's largest stock market. True. But that number for much of post-war history was closer to 40%, about 40-45%. Never this high. So the American stock market, in a way, relative to the rest of the world, has never been this expensive.
Ruchir Sharma, pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, Fareed.